30 minutes before my wedding, I remembered the one thing my grandmother had asked me to wear before she died, and the walk back to get it ended up saving me from a marriage that never should have happened. Her necklace sat in my overnight bag in the guest cottage, 2 buildings away from where I was getting ready. I slipped out quietly, careful not to wrinkle my dress, and stopped just outside the cottage door when I heard voices inside, low, familiar, close together in a way that made my stomach drop before I even understood why. I recognized my fiancé's voice first, then my cousin's. I stood frozen with my hand on the door handle, listening to Grant say something that made the whole morning collapse around me before I'd even walked in. I opened that door 30 minutes before my own wedding, and my world fell apart in the time it took to turn the handle. Welcome to Revenge Stories Narrated, where family betrayal meets inevitable justice, and karma always collects its debt. My name is Chelsea Reed. I'm 28. My family has run Reed Family Vineyards for 3 generations, a small but well-known winery my grandmother, Eleanor, helped build from almost nothing after my grandfather passed away young. Before she died last year, she gave me a necklace that had belonged to her own mother and made me promise to wear it on my wedding day. "So part of me is standing there with you," she said, holding my hands the way she always did when something mattered to her. I met Grant Walker 2 years ago at a wine industry conference, and for most of our relationship, I believed he'd fallen for me specifically, not for anything attached to my name. He worked in wine distribution himself, which made the early months of our relationship feel natural, easy, the kind of shared world where neither of us had to explain our long hours or the way the business consumed our weekends. I didn't know, standing outside that cottage door, that Grant had spent the past several months quietly positioning himself for something much bigger than a wedding. It started small enough that I never noticed the pattern. About 6 months earlier, Grant began asking detailed questions about how the vineyard's ownership structure worked, who held what percentage, how decisions got made at the family level. I found it sweet at the time, assuming he simply wanted to understand the business he was marrying into. He'd ask things like how many acres we leased versus owned, or how our distribution contracts were structured, and I answered every question happily, glad he seemed so invested in a future that included both of us. 2 months after that, my father mentioned, almost in passing, that Grant had asked about formally joining the operations side once we were married, maybe even taking on a management title. I told my father that sounded like a nice way for Grant to feel more connected to the family, and my father, trusting my judgment, quietly began drafting paperwork to add Grant as an operations manager on the vineyard's business filings, effective the week after our wedding. I lost real ground during those months without realizing it, spending less time reviewing the business details myself, since Grant seemed so eager to take an interest, and I mistook his eagerness for love instead of what it actually was. My cousin Paige had been close to our family for years, close enough that she'd been in nearly every family photo since childhood, close enough that I never once thought to question how much time she and Grant spent together during wedding planning, since she was helping coordinate vendors. She'd sat beside me at every Thanksgiving, helped me pick out my dress 2 months earlier, and cried, or seemed to, the day I told her Grant had proposed. If you've ever discovered, all at once, that someone's affection came with strings you never saw attached, tell me in the comments, because I want to know I'm not the only one who's lived through that. Standing outside that cottage door, I heard Grant's voice clearly through the thin wood. "Once I'm officially listed on the business paperwork next week, none of this has to change," he said. "We just keep being careful, same as always." "You're marrying her for the vineyard," Paige said, her voice quiet, almost bored, like this was a conversation they'd had many times before. "I know that. I've always known that." "I care about Chelsea," Grant said. "That part's real too. This doesn't have to be complicated." I opened the door. Neither of them said a word at first. Paige's face went white, and she took a small step backward, closer to the window, as if putting distance between herself and Grant might somehow undo what I'd already heard. Grant stood up so fast he knocked over a chair. "Chelsea, this isn't what it sounds like," he said. "It sounds exactly like what it is," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. "You're marrying me for the vineyard, and you're still sleeping with my cousin." I didn't wait for either of them to answer. I turned around, walked straight past the guest cottage, past the tent already filling with 120 guests, and out to the front gate, where I found the cab I'd asked a groomsman to keep on standby that morning, just in case, a decision I hadn't fully understood myself until that exact moment. I left my own wedding still in my dress, my grandmother's necklace clutched in one hand, having never even put it on. By the time I turned my phone back on that evening, I had 47 missed calls and messages from nearly everyone at the wedding, all asking the same question. Why did I leave? My mother's last message, sent nearly 3 hours after I'd gone, simply read, "Whatever happened, we love you. Call when you're ready." I read that one twice before finally setting the phone down. I didn't explain right away. I stayed at a hotel that night, and the next morning, I called my father, the one person I trusted completely, and told him everything I'd heard through that cottage door. My father went quiet for a long moment. "Chelsea," he said finally, "I already drafted the paperwork adding Grant as operations manager. It was supposed to go through this week." "Don't file it," I said. "Please." My father didn't just stop the filing. He asked a family attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Rebecca Iverson, to review every conversation Grant had ever had about the business, everything documented in emails over the past 6 months. It took Rebecca's team 9 days to gather the full picture, working through message threads, emails, and calendar invitations Grant had never bothered deleting, apparently confident no one would ever think to look. What Rebecca found was worse than either of us expected. Grant had already reached out to a wine distribution company 2 states over, using language that suggested he intended, once formally listed on the business, to quietly renegotiate several of the vineyard's long-standing distribution contracts in ways that would have personally benefited a side consulting arrangement he'd set up under a name that wasn't his own. He hadn't just been planning to marry into influence. He'd been planning to use that influence to move business away from decisions my family had spent 3 generations building, the moment he had the paperwork to make it look legitimate. I didn't confront Grant again directly. I let Rebecca formally close the door on his access instead, sending a clear notice that no such management role would be created, and that any further contact regarding the business's operations would be treated as interference. Word moved quickly through our small industry circle once people started asking why the wedding had ended the way it did. The distribution company Grant had approached, once they learned the arrangement he'd proposed involved a business relationship he had no actual standing to represent, quietly ended the conversation and, separately, mentioned the attempt to 2 other wineries Grant had also approached under similar pretenses. The same quiet positioning Grant used to try to gain control of something that was never fully his ended up being the exact reason every door in the industry closed on him at once, since word travels fast among people who've spent decades building trust the honest way. Rebecca told me later that in a business as small and reputation-driven as ours, a story like Grant's tends to spread faster than any formal complaint ever could, and by the time she'd finished notifying the distribution company in writing, 3 other vineyard owners had already called her office, asking questions of their own. Paige stopped coming to family gatherings after that. My aunt told me, months later, that Paige had genuinely believed Grant would eventually leave me for her once the business arrangement was secured, something Paige herself admitted once confronted directly, tearfully, at a family dinner I chose not to attend. Paige's own engagement, to a man she'd been quietly seeing on and off for over a year, ended not long after, once he found out about Grant through a friend of a friend and realized the full timeline of what had actually been happening. I wore my grandmother's necklace 6 months later, at a small ceremony that wasn't a wedding at all, just a quiet afternoon where my father and I re-signed the business documents together, formally, with my name alone listed as the vineyard's next-generation owner. Reed Family Vineyards had its best season in company history that year, since the story, once it settled, brought a strange kind of attention that turned into genuine interest from new customers who liked knowing exactly who they were supporting. My father hired a new operations manager that same season too, a longtime family friend named Walton Wynn who'd worked vineyards in the region for over 20 years, someone whose only interest in the business was making sure it thrived for another 3 generations. I still keep that necklace in a small box on my dresser, and some mornings I take it out just to hold it, thinking about how 30 minutes and one forgotten piece of jewelry changed the entire direction of my life. My father tells people now, half joking, that Eleanor always did have a way of showing up exactly when she was needed most, even from wherever she is now. If you've ever had to quietly protect what actually mattered instead of walking blindly into what looked good on paper, you already know it works better that way. Subscribe if you want more stories like this one, and tell me down below what you would have done standing at that cottage door.